Hello everyone, good day. I hope you are all doing fine. So again, let me introduce myself. My name is Liam Brent Fernandez Lumundang, but you can always call me Teacher Yami. I'm one of the newest faculty members of the College of Arts and Sciences under the Social Sciences Department. So just a brief background about myself. I am a mass communication graduate from Silliman University, and then I have obtained my Juris Doctor degree from Foundation University. So I am a law graduate, but I'm not yet a lawyer, hopefully someday. So I'm just very much thankful that I was given the opportunity to be your instructor in the subject SOCSCI ED 11, so that I'll be able to share to you the things that I have learned about the laws in our country. And hopefully, I'll be able to inspire you to take the same route as you advance further in your studies eventually in the future. So to begin with, let me just share to you for a while. So to begin with, let me just share to you a brief background about the subject. So this subject was actually designed for you students to be able to understand selected laws in our countries and for you to be able to know how to apply this in your daily lives as a student, as a future teacher, as a future employee, and at the same time as a citizen of this country. So that's the purpose of the subject. And eventually, as we progress with our lectures and in the different modules that I'll provide for you, be able to understand more about our laws here in the Philippines, not just about the Philippine Constitution, but also about civil law, about criminal law, and then labor laws. These are very much helpful for you, especially if you want to expand further your future careers. So to begin with, in your module, if you have read it, I have provided their definitions on what really is a constitution. And there are two definitions. The first one is, it says that it's a body or rules and maxims in accordance which the power of the sovereignty are habitually exercised. So the most important word that we have to understand in this definition is the word sovereignty because it means freedom. So for us to be able to become Filipino citizens and for us to act as a country and for our government to be very much effective in dealing with its powers, we must be free. We must be free from any control of any country. That's why the purpose of the Constitution is to create a government where the people are free, the government is free, the territory is free, and the people are free to do the things that they want to do. And following, we have here another definition of the Philippine Constitution. It has, and I think this is one of my favorite definition of a constitution because for me, I believe it is the most complete and the most concise definition of a constitution. It says here it is a written instrument enacted by the direct action of the people by which the fundamental powers of the government are established, limited, and defined, and by which those powers are distributed among several departments for their safe and useful exercise and for the benefit of the body politic. So for us to better understand this definition, let's try to dissect it line by line. The first one, it is a written instrument enacted by the direct action of the people. So if you have noticed, I have highlighted written instrument and direct action of the people. So it is a written instrument. So you have to remember that there are two types of a constitution, a written constitution such as the Philippine Constitution and an unwritten constitution. So when you say written constitution, it has been reduced into writing and it has been put in a single document. So that's what our Philippine Constitution is. We have written our Philippine Constitution in a single document. And then the second part of this line, it says here that enacted by the direct action of the people. What do they mean by that? Direct action of the people. So basically, the Philippine Constitution is actually a direct legislation because if you I'll be discussing it further eventually in our second lesson, by the way. But if you're in our history, when the 1987 Philippine Constitution was actually created, it was just drafted. It was only written, sulatra, drafted by the members of the Constitutional Commission. However, for it to be approved, it needs the votes of the Filipino people. That is why we have a plebiscite. We were given a plebiscite, meaning at that time there was an election specifically called for just for the approval or the rejection of the drafted constitution that was made by the CONCOM at the time. And then the thing is, the Filipino voted to approve the constitution. So it became a direct legislation. When you say direct legislation, the power that made this constitution into a law came from the people because the people themselves approved this law. This is very much different from our laws in the country, which are actually made by the members of the House of the Representatives and the Senate, members of the Senate, given that we people did not take part in approving these laws. However, with the Philippine Constitution, it is us, the Filipino people, acting in our sovereign capacity that we're able to approve the Philippine Constitution. So, given that it is our direct legislation, it became the most supreme law of the land and the highest law of the land. Hence, no other laws can go against it. So that's why it's very important to emphasize that it is a direct legislation from the Filipino people. The second line, by which the fundamental powers of the government are established, limited, and defined. The fundamental powers, actually, when you read powers, at first you will be somehow confused with the inherent powers of the government, given that the inherent powers of the state, I have discussed them actually in this module. We have the inherent power of the power of eminent domain, the police power, and the power of taxation. But however, these inherent powers, we call them inherent powers because they were already created by the time of the creation of the state. What do you mean by the fundamental powers? When you say fundamental powers, these powers are the powers that are created under the Philippine Constitution. So the power of taxation, eminent domain, and police powers were not created in the Constitution, but rather the powers that were actually created or that were established, defined, and limited under the Philippine Constitution are the powers to execute laws under the executive department, the power to enact laws or to create laws under the legislative department, and the power to interpret laws under the judicial department. And these powers are actually established and defined. At the same time, they were limited. And aside from these powers, there were already other powers that were also created in the Philippine constitutions, and these powers had been laid down in the different constitutional commissions. Or when you say constitutional commissions, these are the commissions or the offices that were also created in the Philippine Constitution. An example would be the Commission on Election, the Commission on Audit, the Office of the Ombudsman, the Commission on Human Rights. These are examples of constitutional commissions or offices that were created under the Philippine Constitution, and they are also one of the fundamental powers that were actually established and defined and limited under the Philippine Constitution. But we have to dwell more on the word limited. And in order for us to understand that better, let's go to the next line. So for our third line, it says here, and by which those powers are distributed among several departments for their safe and useful exercise and for the benefit of the body politic. So this is actually one of the most important lines in this definition of the Constitution, given that it states one of the most effective principles in our Constitution, and that is the principle of checks and balances. So when you say check and balances, it means that you have to understand right now, I think you already know by now, that there are three branches of the government: the executive department, the legislative department, and the judicial department. And the thing is, these three are separate and distinct from each other. They cannot encroach the power of each other. They should be independent from each other. However, under the principles of checks and balances, they can look into the works or the actions of the other departments or other branches. At the same time, do something about it if there is abuse of power. An example would be the creation of law. So in order for a law to be created, the House of Representatives, at the same time, the Senate will pass a bill, will enact a bill. And this bill will be actually sent to the office of the Philippine President. And the Philippine President would either accept or reject or veto this law. So basically, if the President will reject this law, it will not have a power at all, and it will just remain a bill under the legislative department. However, if the President will approve this bill, it will now turn into a law. However, that's not the final stage of how to pass a law. Because eventually, when there are people who thinks that there are some problems with this laws that has been approved by the President, the judicial department can actually look into the law that has been approved by the President. And they can actually declare it unconstitutional. And once a law has been declared unconstitutional, it will become null and void, meaning it will not have any powers at all. So somehow, that's one way of, that's an example actually of the principle of checks and balances. So although these departments are actually separate and distinct, and they are much powerful on their own, being independent. However, it was also important that these other departments can look into their actions so that abuses and corruption can be prevented. So I think that's one of the most beautiful things that has actually been created in our Philippine Constitution. And ideally, our Constitution is very much beautiful because it has really looked into the principle of checks and balances. And I think through that, ideally, we'll be able to stop corruption. So let's proceed. So these are the very important ideas that are created under our Constitution. Number one, the Philippine Constitution serves as the supreme law of the land. Being the supreme law of the land, it should symbolize and signify the people's will. The Constitution must be obeyed by all, and the Constitution is the framework of the Philippine government. I think I have already explained why the Philippine Constitution serves as the supreme law of the land, because the Philippine Constitution is a direct legislation of the people. It is the Filipino people who approve. It is the Filipino people who had say to implement or to enact the Philippine Constitution. So somehow, because it has become the supreme law of the land, no law shall go against it. So that's why we have explained earlier that once a judicial or a law has been recognized as unconstitutional by the judicial department, it does not have a power at all, because it is against the ideals and the principles that has been provided by our Philippine Constitution. And if it is against the ideals and the principles under the Philippine Constitution, then it go against the will of the Filipino people. That's why it should not be implemented and should be declared void. And also, we have already mentioned that the Philippine Constitution is a framework of the Philippine government because it has created, it has given fundamental powers of the the Philippine government. So again, it has established and defined the powers of the Philippine government, and at the same time, it has limited them. So that's why it's very important that checks and balances should always be practiced at all times in order to prevent corruption and any forms of abuse. So we have here the Philippine Constitution is classified as written, conventional, and rigid. As I mentioned earlier, the Philippine Constitution is written. It is written because it has been reduced into writing, and at the same time, it has been embodied in a single document. It's very much different from an unwritten constitution, because an unwritten constitution, such as the Constitution of the United Kingdom, it's actually it's unwritten in a sense that it is just a collection of the gradual development, political development of the country. So it includes the traditions, legislation, state legislations, or the laws that has been created by their legislative department, and other important proclamations. And the thing is, it's very difficult to analyze if these documents are a part of the Constitution, because these records are actually scattered all around, and there's no single department that is actually holding these documents together. So it's very much harder, it's very hard to study an unwritten constitution, given that their records are actually scattered all around, and it's only those people with constitutional background be able to identify if these records are actually part of the Constitution or not. And there are actually only 3 countries in the world right now that are using an unwritten constitution, but it's up to you to research it. I think I have listed, I think I have asked you to provide for these countries, the name of these countries that are using an unwritten constitution. So it's part of the research. Hopefully, you're able to find them already right now. So the second one is the Philippine Constitution is also classified as conventional. What do you mean conventional? When we say conventional, it means that we have deliberately and consciously created the Philippine Constitution. That is why it's very important that every time the Constitution is to be made, we have to call for a constitutional commission, meaning we have to call on some experts, some people who are expert or luminaries, we call them luminaries in the legal field, or those people with experience, or those people who know more about the government and how to know more about the government to become members of the Constitutional Commission, because these people are actually the ones who will draft the Constitution. At the same time, the Filipino people are aware that there is actually a constitution that is being drafted, and the Filipino people are also given the power to actually approve or reject this constitution that has been drafted. So that is why the Philippine Constitution is classified as conventional, because we Filipino people were conscious and we were deliberate in actually approving this constitution. And then lastly, the Philippine Constitution is actually classified as rigid. When you say rigid, it means that there is actually a formal way of amending our Philippine Constitution. We cannot just amend it right there and then just change some parts or articles of the Philippine Constitution. In fact, in order to change just a single word of the Philippine Constitution, we need to have an actual process for it. It's very different from a law. When you want to actually amend a law, you can just create another legislation. But the Philippine Constitution is very hard, because you need to call on, you need a specific number of votes in order for a constitutional commission to be called for. And at the same time, when a constitutional commission has been called for, and after you draft a new constitution or after you amend the Philippine Constitution, you still need an approval of the Filipino people again. So somehow it's very rigid, it's very difficult to change the Philippine Constitution, but it's actually very important. You know, the rationale of it is that because we Filipino people and those who have drafted the Philippine Constitution, we're thinking that if a single person, or if it's very easy to actually amend our Philippine Constitution, then there's a tendency that a person who is very hungry of power can actually change our Philippine Constitution just easily, and then give a certain branch or a certain position more power. If that happens, then there will be more corruption, there will be more abuses in our government. So somehow, because of our Philippine Constitution being so rigid and being so difficult to be actually amended, we can actually prevent. We are preventing any abuses of power in the future. We are preventing any form of corruption in the future. So that's why it's very important. And I think that's one of the good thing of having a rigid constitution, because you can actually prevent any person or any group of people to exercise that much power. So we have come here to the next topic, which is the essential parts of the Constitution. So we have here the Constitution of Liberty, we have the Constitution of Government, and the Constitution of Sovereignty. So for the Constitution of Liberty, when you say Constitution, it means actually making or providing. So when you say Constitution, it has provided for the political and civil rights of the Filipino people, at the same time the limitation of the Philippine government. So I won't give you specific the articles where you can find this, because I have also given that to you as an assignment in your module. However, one of the examples that you can find where you can find the Constitution of Liberty is actually the human rights, the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights for the Filipino people. So somehow, in a way, the Bill of Rights has provided for rights for the Filipino people. And one of the most important rights that has been provided for us is the right to suffrage. And when you say right to suffrage, it means you're given the right to vote. And under the Constitution, Filipino people who are already in the age of majority or at 18 years old can actually vote. And it's very important. That's one of the very important rights that has been provided for the Filipino people, because through that rights, the Filipino people are given the opportunity to take part in the decision making of our government, because we elect people whom we think are knowledgeable, who have the heart, the compassion, and who can really lead our country. So that's why it's very important for you, Filipino people, at the age of 18 to register there and vote, because that's one of the most important rights that has been provided for under the Philippine Constitution. At the same time, again, as I mentioned earlier, the Constitution of Liberty has actually also provided for the limitations of the government. So what are the limitations that we are talking about here? So right now, I'm thinking about due process. Under the human rights, we have also the rights of the accused. And under the Philippine Constitution, it says there that no person shall be deprived of um, shall not be deprived of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And when we say due process of law, it's actually a form of limitation from the Philippine government, because in a way, no people should receive penalties or should receive any punishment without due process of law. So meaning you should be heard first. You must give your reasons why you're able to do these things before you be actually punished if ever you have committed a crime. So there must be due process in every stages when a person is accused of a crime. And then for the next one, it provides for the constitution of the government. When you say constitution of the government, it has provided for the power of the government. And there are also several articles in our Philippine Constitution that has provided for the powers of the government. And one power that has provided for is the powers of the Philippine President, the powers of the Vice President, the power of the House of Representatives, and the powers of the members of the Senate. So they are provided for under the Constitution of Liberty. The next one, we have the Constitution of the government, I mean. So the next one, we have the Constitution of Sovereignty. So when you say Constitution of Sovereignty, it has provided for, this is the part of the Constitution which has provided for the amendment. So this actually the steps to be followed, or the rules, or yeah, the rules and the rules and steps to be followed for us to be able to to formally amend our Philippine Constitution. Again, it's the Philippine Constitution that has provided for its amendment on how to change some parts of the Philippine Constitution. It has been provided for it under the Philippine Constitution. It cannot be found in any other laws, but rather it is only in the Constitution, and it should be followed once we change our Constitution. Even just changing a single word or a single line, it must follow the Philippine Constitution and how to amend the Philippine Constitution. And it has provided for under the Constitution also very anything. And again, I'm giving it to you as an assignment as to what articles or what article is it that you can find the Constitution also very in the Philippine Constitution. So now we have come to our lesson in state. So what is a state? Before we proceed with a definition of what is really a state, let's know first the difference between a state and a nation. So it says here a state is a legal or political concept, while a nation is a racial or ethnic concept. So when you actually say state, in layman's terms, it all means country, the country of the Philippines. The Philippines is actually an example of a state. The United States of America is a state. It is composed of different states, but the states that are referred to in the United States of America is very much different from the state that we are referring to in this definition, because the United States of America is, or USA, is the state itself composed of different states. So another state, an example of a state is Japan, China. These are actually states. While a nation is a racial or ethnic concept. When you say nation, it refers to the people. It refers to the Filipino people. So we, the Filipino people, is actually a nation, and that is what the nation is referring to. We, the Filipino people. So it's more on our racial or ethnic concept. And in fact, it's very important to note that a single state can actually be composed of different nations. So here, in order for us to understand more what is a state, a definition of a state has been provided in your module, and it says it's a community of persons, more or less numerous, permanently occupying a fixed territory, possessing an organized government, free from external control, to which the great body of inhabitants render habitual obedience. So if you take this definition of a state, you'll be able to understand what really is a state, given that this definition has provided for all the elements of a state. The first element of a state is mentioned in community of persons more or less numerous. For a state to be created, it needs its people. So this is what is being referred to in this line, community of person more or less numerous. So a state, in order for it to be existing, it needs people. And then following, it says permanently occupying a fixed territory, which means a state also needs a territory. So for a state to exist, it needs a fixed territory. So somehow the territory of the Philippines has been defined in the Article 1 of the Philippine Constitution. So next, it says possessing an organized government. So again, an important part of a state is a government. A state needs a government because it's a government that will lead the people and is in charge of the affairs of the state. So that's why for a state to be created, it needs a government. And then it says here, free from external control, to which a great body of inhabitants render habitual obedience. So this free from external control means that a state also needs sovereignty. Sovereignty, it needs freedom. Again, you cannot be considered an independent state if you are still depending, your affairs will still depend on another state. You need external control, meaning you can stand alone. You are independent for you to be considered a state. So it's very important for a state to have its people, for it to have a territory, for it to have a government, and at the same time for it to have a sovereignty. So next, what are the fundamental powers inherent to the state? So I mentioned earlier, when you say inherent to the state, it means that these powers are actually created upon the creation of the state. It does not need any legislation, and it does not need the constitution to be created. So what are these powers that were created upon the creation of the state, or the fundamental powers? The first one is the police power. The second one is the power of eminent domain. And the third one is the power of taxation. So the police power is very important because it is a power to promote and protect the general welfare. And when you say general welfare, it means sa Bisaya pa, kaayuhan sa kadaghanan. So just like during our time, what is happening right now, we are having a pandemic. The Philippine government was able to deploy police and military power in order to control the people. That's actually a valid exercise of the police power because it's only thinking of the promotion and protection of the state. In fact, when there are problems in the state, or the Philippine government just want to promote general welfare, the Philippine government can actually provide for laws and regulations that would actually help in aiding to protect and promote the health of the people, the general welfare of the people, and any other matters of the state. And in fact, the police power is actually considered as the most unlimited power of the Philippine government because it's very hard to limit the police and the police powers, especially because there are times when the power of the state is actually threatened, especially by some forces, not just external forces, but internal forces like drugs and other forms of criminalities. The Philippine government can actually extend its police powers in order to stop this kind of problems that we have in the country. But at the same time, for our safety and for the promotion of peace in our country, it's very important to promote police power. The next one is the power of eminent domain. When you say power of eminent domain, it's actually the taking of the Philippine government of a private property in order to be used for the public. So there are two conditions for it to be considered a valid exercise of the power of eminent domain. The first one is for public use. It must be used by the public para sa kayuhan sa tanan. What are the examples of public use? When we have public market or public plaza or gym, schools. These are public for public use. Anyone, everybody can actually use these facilities. That is why once the government will take a private property, it should be noted that it should only be used for public use, and which means everyone can actually have access to this. So the second requirement for the power of eminent domain to be validly exercised is the payment of just compensation. And what do you mean just compensation? It means that the owner of the private property should be paid on the fair market value of the property. So no private property should be taken by the government without payment of just compensation. Because if that happens, that is an invalid taking and it's not a proper exercise of the power of eminent domain. So once gani mukuha ang government property from a private person, there must be payment of just compensation, and at the same time, that property should be used for the benefit of the public. So for the next slide, we have the power of taxation. That is actually the third inherent power of the state. And for it to be considered as a valid exercise of power of taxation, the taxation must be used for public purposes. So why do you think it's very important? Taxation is very much important. It's actually very important because taxes are the lifeblood of the government. The government cannot move or cannot provide its services to the Filipino people if it will not take taxes from the Filipino people. So we have to pay our taxes for our government to survive because it's our only way of earning. And once they earn something from that, they have to return that for public purposes. They have to return what they have taken from us for public purposes. So when you say when you see improvements from in our country, from our government, it means that our government is really working hard. They are using our taxes for us to be they are using our taxes to provide improvements and developments in our country. So that's why it's very important that we pay our taxes so that more improvements and developments can be seen in our country. And we can actually help more poor people get good education and health services. And also, one thing about the power of taxation is that it is also considered as the power to destroy by the Philippine government, because if the Philippine government wants to regulate something, they can actually provide for higher taxes. Like for example, vice taxes. Vice taxes were actually enacted by the legislative in order to regulate the selling of cigarettes and liquor. And in fact, if there are companies that would actually close down because of paying high taxes and they're not getting return of investments, it's actually very, very, very valid because the 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 Philippine government can actually destroy from the power to destroy. So they can actually destroy or close or stop um, some some industries through imposing higher taxes because that's one way of regulating the power. That's actually one way of regulating this these industries which are actually considered as nuances under our government. So if they see that it's a new one, they can actually provide for higher taxes. They would collect higher taxes from these industries, and these industries will eventually close down because they cannot pay any more these high taxes and provided for the government. And it's actually very valid because again, the power of taxation is actually considered as the power to destroy by the Philippines. So we have come to the conclusion of my lesson one. This is actually just the first part of my discussion for the first module of the subject. So by next week, I'll be uploading another discussion again on the lesson two for our module. And hopefully you have understand a thing or two from this discussion. And if you have other questions or any issues or concern in the subject, you can always comment down below so that I can actually address them afterwards. So thank you so much for listening and have a good day.